So I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Hugh Quarshie, who's going to deliver tonight's lecture, Mental Slavery, Lessons from the Life of Anton Willhelm Amo, 18th century African scholar. Hugh.
Thank you, Oku, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for turning out tonight on what I know is the first night of a special Holby City two-part special. I won't be keeping you long, because I'm sure you'll be going to rush back to see what happens tonight, so you can enjoy what happens on Thursday night. So let me begin by saying that my full name is Hugh Anthony A.W.Amo Quarshie. Quarshie, because that's my father's name. And as I'm sure that most of you will know, it is a name of some distinction in Ghana, and one which I and my brother share with the man who planted the first cocoa pod in Ghana in 1876, Tete Quarshie, after whom hospitals and roundabouts are named. And as I'm afraid that some of you will also know, the name is equally distinguished in Jamaica, but for entirely different reasons. Quarshie being synonymous with an idiot, possibly deriving from the Akan word kwasia, which means idiot. But I shall try to favor the Ghanaian version. I'm called Kobna because I'm a male child born on a Tuesday, and that distinguishes me from the Kojos, the Kwekus, the Ekos, the Kofis, the Kwamis, and the Kwesis, on other days of the week. Of course, had we been women, we would be called Ajua, Abna, Ekua, Aba, Efi, Ama, Esi, as I recall. My father named me Hugh after a Jewish colleague of his who later converted to Anglicanism and joined the priesthood and voluntarily took a vow of celibacy. I've never really thought that the name Hugh suited me. I was happier with the other names that he gave me. Anthony Amo. Not least because Ghanaians are very fond of initials, and H-A-K-A made for an onomatopoeically very impressive name, Haka. But I was happier for other reasons. My father claimed direct descent from an 18th century scholar and sage who, like him, hailed, as Ghanaians are fond of saying, from Axim in western Ghana, close to the border with the Côte d'Ivoire. And it was not just my father who claimed kinship with this scholar of legend. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of the Republic of Ghana, and another proud Inzima man, wrote about him briefly in his book, The Autobiography of Kwame Nkrumah. He describes the mesmerizing effect that he had on a mass rally while on a visit to Liberia in 1952, and I quote, "I knew from past experience that the sight of a crowd before me was all I needed to encourage the words to flow. Africa for the Africans, I cried. My words were lost in a roar of acclamation, and it was several minutes before it was quiet enough for me to proceed. As instances of Africans who had already proved their capabilities to the world, I instanced Anthony William Amo, professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin, and Toussaint Louverture, a hero in the field of battle." And in a footnote, he adds, "In America, I discovered that Amo an Innsbruck man from Maxim, had written a thesis, Tractatus de Arte Sobrie et Accurate Philosophandi, published at Halle in 1738. I also learned that a copy had been lodged in the British Museum, and I planned to produce a pamphlet on the work of this scholar, the first from the Gold Coast. When I arrived in London, I eagerly visited the British Museum, but alas, Amo's thesis had been destroyed by a German bombing raid in 1941. Thus, he was spared the onerous task, or should I say, he was denied the great opportunity of translating the original Latin. But it's not just to the Innsbruck men that the story of Amo matters. In the third of his 2016 Wreath Lectures, the preeminent philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, an old schoolmate of my brother's, began his disquisition on race by recounting the story of Anton Willhelm Amo and using it to suggest that though race may be a fact, it is not a fate. And the current Minister of Culture and the Performing Arts in Ghana, the Honourable Catherine Afeku, is planning a major commemoration and celebration of the son of Ghana, who nevertheless remains little known outside African studies courses. So, who was he, and why does he matter? And why should he matter to anyone who isn't Intima, Ghanaian, or enrolled on an African studies course? I shall suggest that his significance lies less in the fact that he emulated the great European scholars of his time, and he excelled them, but that he saw the limitations, the contradictions, and the hypocrisies of the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung. He saw them, he found them wanting, and moved beyond them, thereby liberating himself from mental slavery. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, a few biographical details. There are some things that we can safely say that we know, some that we can only infer, and some about which we can only speculate. Let's begin with what we more or less know. Amo was born in or around 1703 in Awukenu, Axim, located along the Guinea coast, as it was designated in maps at the time, but now in modern-day Ghana. An obituary of a European called David-Henri Gallandé, which was published in 1782, makes reference to Amo after his return to Axim. While he was on this trip to Axim on the Gold Coast in Africa, he went to visit the famous Mr. Anthony William Amo, a Guinea African doctor of philosophy and master of arts. He was a Negro who lived about 30 years in Europe. He had been in Amsterdam in the year 1707 and was presented to the Duke Anton Ulrich of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, who gave him later to his son, August Willhelm. The latter made it possible for him to study in Halle and in Wittenberg. In the year 1727, he was promoted to Doctor of Philosophy and Master in the Liberal Arts. Sometime after this, his master died. This made him so depressed that it influenced him into returning to his fatherland. Here he lived like a hermit and acquired the reputation of a soothsayer. He spoke different languages, including Hebrew, Latin, French, High and Low German. He was skilled in astrology and astronomy and was generally a great sage. He was then about 50 years old. His father and one sister were still alive and resided at a place 4 days' journey inland He had a brother who was a slave in Suriname. Later, he left A.W.Amo and went to live in the fort of the West Indies Company of St. Sebastian at Chama. I have to say the obituarist seems more interested in Amo than in Galande, about whom I know nothing except that he was a Swiss-Dutch physician who worked as a ship's surgeon. That's a bit more showbiz. Amo was thought to have returned to A.W.Amo in about 1753 and located his father and sister, who were still living. Now, the fact that he kept his Akan name, Amo, and that he knew his place of origin suggests that he was not taken as a slave. He may have been identified as a likely candidate for training as a predikant, a preacher, in the Dutch Reformed Church, before returning to preach the Protestant ethic to other Africans. Though I have to say, taking a child aged 3 or 4 away from his family, it does seem a little extreme. I mean, even the Jesuits waited until the child was 7. By the way, I'm indebted to Michel Dortmund of Leiden University for keeping me abreast of the current research into what he tells me are the hundreds of African boys who were sent to Europe, probably as household servants, since chattel slavery was actually illegal in most parts of Europe at that time, which made it very difficult for Americans visiting Europe with their slaves. We don't know exactly how he came to the attention of Duke Anton Ulrich. I had hoped to manage to show you a picture of the Duke in all his finery, but my memory stick didn't work. But he seems to have been adopted and baptized as a Protestant in 1707 and given the names Anton Willhelm. And he was confirmed in the same chapel at Salztal Schloss in 1721. The church register lists him as Anton Wilhelm Rudolf Mohr, Mohr being the German term for Moor. In between his baptism and his confirmation, the Duke, Anton Ulrich, recanted the Augsburg Confession, which since 1530 had been the doctrinal basis of Lutheran Protestantism. He recanted the Augsburg Confession and converted to Catholicism, publishing a book, 50 Reasons Why One Must Be a Catholic. This appalled his son, who disowned him, but took over the education of Anton Wilhelm Amo. The Dukes of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel and Buttel employed as their librarian Gottfried Leibniz, the renowned philosopher and mathematician and inventor of the mechanical calculator. He was what you call a philosophical optimist. His creed was, God assuredly always chooses the best. The idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds, whether or not we know it. By the way, he was savagely mocked by Voltaire in his novel Candide, and who created Voltaire basing the character of Dr. Pangloss on Leibniz. In 1727, Amo enrolled in the University of Halle to study law. Halle had the reputation of being one of the bastions of the Aufklärung, a haven of anti-clerical intellectual freedom. In 1729, Amo published his dissertation on the rights of Africans in Europe, De Jure Marorum in Europa. It has yet to be traced, but is thought to have been an attempt to argue that the slave trade was not simply morally indefensible, but also illegal according to ancient Roman law. African kings, just like their European counterparts, were vassals of Rome, the argument went, and as such enjoyed the same freedom as Roman citizens. Around this time, Pietism was a growing influence. The German Pietists, comparable to the English Puritans, preached an ascetic Protestantism, proving one's purity through self-denying deeds and thereby earning salvation. Faith alone, it seems, was not enough. The time of the humanist freethinkers at Halle was over, and Amo enrolled at the University of Wittenberg in 1730, where he studied medicine, physiology, and psychology. He was nothing if not a polymath. He was awarded his degree in medicine and science in 1733. In 1734, he published a second dissertation, De humanae mentis apathiae siu sensionis et facultatis sentiendi in mente humana absentia et eorum in corpore nostro organico ac vivo presentia. Did I mention that he also spoke and wrote in Latin? As I'm sure you know, this translates as, of the apathia of the mind, of the human mind, namely the absence of sensation and the faculty of sense in the mind and their presence in our organic and living body. This was an acclaimed critique of Descartes' theory of dualism, the opposition between mind and body, and need not detain us here. For those who might wish to look further into the subject, this work is extant, though written in Latin. I note that Dr. Nkrumah made no attempt to write a pamphlet about that. It was about this time that he published his book on the art of sober and accurate philosophizing. According to the preeminent Ghanaian scholar, Willhelm, who appears to have had more success than Nkrumah in tracking down a copy, it discussed the nature and boundaries of the human mind, the classification and grounding principles of species of knowledge, the relation of philosophy to other intellectual pursuits, and presented philosophy as logic, ontology, rational psychology, ethics, and politics. This was around at the same time as Carl von Linné was cataloguing the different species of plants or plant life in Sweden. So the idea of cataloguing and specifying was current in Europe at that time. But this was, in other words, a rebuff to the Pietist scholars who now held sway in Halle. In 1739, Amo moved and gave lectures at the University of Jena. In 1747, there appeared a report about a satirical play, A Comic Student, The False Academic Virgin, and Magister Amo's Proposal. I've mused whether Mozart and his librettist Schikaneder might have dimly recalled this story 40 or so years later when creating the character of Monostatos in The Magic Flute. Monostatos is made to sing, "Everyone feels love's joy, billing and cooing, flirting, hugging and kissing, but I'm supposed to do without love, because a black man is ugly. Dear good moon, forgive me. A white woman has enthralled me. White is beautiful, and I must kiss her." That's my own direct translation of Mozart's libretto. But it was shortly after this that he returned to Axim. And this has promoted some speculation that he left Prussia humiliated by this caricature, broken-hearted at his rejection by a German girl, and depressed by the death of his mentor, and dejected at the triumph of the Pietists. But I'd like to suggest another explanation for his return to his homeland. After 4 decades in Europe, he was not so much depressed as disillusioned. He had witnessed the emergence of Prussian militarism under Friedrich Wilhelm I, and then under Friedrich II, Frederick the Great. He had seen how pietism had lent itself to Prussian ideology, that the state itself was the vehicle for the values of ascetic Protestantism. The Prussian ethos was to inculcate in the individual the idea of discipline and service to the state. And under Frederick the Great, that meant taking part in the War of the Austrian Succession and fighting, and usually winning, a series of battles to gain control of the province of Silesia. Under his rule, Prussia became the Sparta of the North. And theirs was a religion that seemed not to promote peace, but to teach, make war, not love. He had witnessed the perversion of the idea of the pietistic doctrine of meliorism, the idea that the world can be made better by human efforts. While he would have appreciated the great privilege of living under the same roof as Gottfried Leibniz, he may well have read Voltaire's Candide and agreed that we cannot remotely be living in the best of all possible worlds. Johann Wolfgang Goethe did not publish his theory of colours until 1810, but his assertion that people of refinement tend toward monochrome and shun promiscuous colour schemes would have been based on empirical observation. And my empirical observation here this evening is that we are all people of refinement. Look around, not many colours here tonight. Coming from the land of the kente cloth, which I'm sure most of you would have seen, Amo would have wrapped himself in the physical and intellectual colourlessness of the Protestant Prussians. The distinction between chromophobes, the Northern Europeans, and chromophiliacs, the Akan peoples of West Africa, indeed any Africa, is an interesting one. Monochromes being associated with essences, with classical purity, with the cerebral. Colours being associated with the primitive, with the pre-literate, the physical. According to this view, the chromophile sees the world in a different way, thinks about the world in a different way. And this may link to the belief system of the Insma people to whom Amo returned. The Italian anthropologist Grottonelli has written that the world of the Insma is crowded with gods. Edenkema, the senior god, Nyamenle, the sky god, Azele Yaba, the earth goddess, among others. He writes, a polytheistic pantheon does not have the rigidity of a theological system. Theology and dogma are alien to the spirit of polytheistic religion. Returning to A.W.Amo, I suggest, might have prompted Amo to think that objectivity may not be possible, it may not even be desirable. That the strictly empirical observations shows, in fact, that certain feelings of the soul are unintelligible to those who have never experienced them. Ironically, those words were written by a European in 1929, Pina, quoted by Grottonelli in a 1969 essay. In his 2001 essay, The True Enzima, Pier Luigi Vasecchi quotes the Dutch governor of A.W.Amo, J.P.T. Heidekoper, who wrote in 1762, among them, they are all divided into different stocks or tribes, the origin of which neither they nor we know, but it has so much influence on their common life. Some of the tribes are closely attached to others, others strongly against each other. The consequence is that however great their disagreements may be, they are accustomed to help each other against a third party. From a highly sophisticated continent, literate, monochrome, refined, but ravaged by war, I imagine Amo returning to his vibrantly colourful, fractious, unsophisticated homeland and wondering why the hell he'd stayed away so long. But I don't want to suggest that all things African are good. Kwame Anthony Appiah returned to Ghana for the funeral of his father, Joe Appiah, distinguished parliamentarian. And he defied the king of the Asantehene, and denounced the attempt to hijack his father's funeral by imposing traditional mourning practices upon him and his sisters. When you defy the king of the Asante, that's going too far by Akan standards. And that caused quite a scandal at the time. Amo returned to find that his twin brother, Atta, had been abducted by Dutch privateers and taken to Suriname. He demanded the repatriation of his brother and the arrest of the Dutch privateers. The privateers were indeed arrested, but it appears that his brother had not survived, and he and his family, his father and his sister, were offered 6,800 guilders in compensation. Amo continued to denounce the slave trade and may have eventually been incarcerated in the Dutch fort at Shama, where he died. As I see it, he left the ivory towers of Academe only to end his days in a fort. But is it going too far? Is it fanciful to suggest that his free-thinking, outspoken views had brought him into direct conflict not just with the Dutch, but with the coastal tribes, with his own people, who may well have colluded in and benefited from the trade in human beings? I think we have to acknowledge with a heavy heart that the slave trade would not have lasted as long as it did without the collusion of other Africans. As a sort of coda, I'm encouraged to think that Amo, like Appiah, moved beyond both Western intellectual traditions and African cultural traditions. In his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot has an interesting line. The past is altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. I'm not entirely sure what he had in mind when he wrote that, but it seems to me that we can only know the past as history, and history is constantly being reinterpreted. But in the meantime, it serves as a kind of palimpsest, as a mold in which our thoughts are formed. And it takes us a long time for those thoughts to escape the mold. In my own case, it's taken me a similar amount of time to reach a similar point. I have moved, I hope, beyond Shakespeare. In the time that remains to me, I now have to perform a sort of cultural triage. I have to decide whether to stick with what might be called the Desert Island Discs box set of cultural values, the Holy Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare, or try to move beyond. Should I read Herman Melville or Armin Malouf? Should I read Mark Twain or Amos Tutuola? Should I read Martin Amis or A.W.Amo? I'm frankly not sure I have the intellectual capacity to do both. I hope that while I decide, I don't get locked up in a fort. I'll leave it there.